Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by KosherCloth.com. One thing I appreciate about KosherCloth.com is how easy they make buying stam. Whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a megillah, or even a sefer Torah, they take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit KosherCloth.com. That's KosherKlaf.com, or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find the link and information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status. Also, check out the newly redesigned Svarim Chatter website, and check out especially the feature bookstore, where you can find the books and Svarim discussed on the podcast. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Jason Kalman, who is a professor of classical Hebrew literature and interpretation and is an author of a number of books, including two that we'll be discussing here on this episode, which one of them is the Book of Job in Jewish Life and Thought Critical Essays, and another one is the commentary of Abraham Ibn Ezra on the Book of Job, Introduction, Translation, and Annotation by Jason Kalman. So that's Ibn Ezra's commentary on Job, on Iyov. So we'll be discussing Job, Iyov, and I think it's appropriate for this time of year, as we'll get into a little bit here, which is something that you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av. Some did study it on Tisha B'Av in the 9 days. So regardless, thank you, Professor Kalman, for joining me.
I'm so pleased to be with you.
Let's sort of tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I have been a professor of classical Hebrew literature and interpretation for 20-odd years. I did my undergraduate degree in Jewish education at McGill and decided that I didn't know enough to go teach anyone, so I thought I should do a master's degree in Jewish studies and broaden what I could do. And at that point, I started teaching middle school, and to the teachers out there who still do that, they are my heroes, because I couldn't survive in that environment, and decided I might be better behind the scenes and started on a doctorate in curriculum design and Midrash, and fell in love at that time with Midrash Iyov, which turned into a slightly different doctoral project in Jewish studies on the history of the interpretation of the Book of Job more broadly. I'm a day school graduate who, in 10th grade, read Iyov as part of the curriculum and found no satisfactory answers. And despite my various efforts over the years to do other things, it consistently has drawn me back, even in the years since I finished these books. There are still Job projects continuing.
Before we even focus on Iyov itself, but listeners are probably listening to Iyov, Job, maybe they know of it, maybe they don't. We're going to get more into that, into the book itself, right? Yeah. But why, they're probably thinking, Professor Kalman, are you interested in this? Like, what drew your interest to this book? Well, I don't want to say odd, but I mean, really, it's kind of a unique of one of the Svarim in Tanakh. Why?
Well, I think as Jewish readers of the book, we don't read the book on its own. It's read as part of a canon. It's in the Tanakh. And if you have studied other books of the Tanakh, particularly those shaped by Devarim and the theological positions in Devarim, Job seems to be a complete outlier, because not only is it a little bit different, it seems to stand in direct opposition to the notions of justice that Devarim and books of Deuteronomic theology promise. If you behave, if you do what you're supposed to, if you follow halacha, then there are supposed to be rewards. And Job, on its face, seems to present its primary character, Iyov, as doing precisely what he's supposed to be doing. And then in a glimpse to the behind-the-scenes working of the heavens, he apparently suffers tragedy that we would typically relate to punishment. And yet God, in chapter 2, seems to suggest that whatever is going on, Job is not deserving any of this. Everything has been done chinam, without sufficient cause. And I think if you're raised on Dvarim, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Despite having wonderful teachers, none ever gave me a satisfying answer, and I I dare say that even after now 30 odd years of studying the book, I'm still not entirely certain that I have comfortable answers. But I can explain, I think, why people came to the ones they chose.
Yeah, and there's a lot of mefarshim written on Iyov. This was a very popular book at one point. In fact, the largest part of your book, the Book of Job in Jewish Life and Thought, is a kind of overview, a survey of all the different mefarshim and when it was written, who wrote it, the basics of that period, which, by the way, just fascinating chapter just to read that for those interested in like Jewish history even, because if you could just read about all these little figures and what they were writing about. So, but I want to, let's at least give an overview of Iyov. I know that it's one of the Sfarim in Tanakh. People might be familiar, but not everyone. This is not like your bedtime reading. It's not something that even you learn in yeshiva or you learn every day. So not everyone is super familiar with it. So at least just a kind of an overview of Iyov.
So let me do that. But I just want to respond to your comment, which is Iyov is a really fascinating book, in part because it had such popularity amongst Jewish scholarship. Despite the fact that it appears nowhere as a demand within the Jewish liturgy, right? That is, there's no obligation to read the book publicly at any point, only hints and suggestions that one might do so. And so the fact that it became popular amongst particularly medieval Jewish readers, I think says something interesting in and of itself. So as an overview of the book, and it's a long book, it opens with a frame narrative in which we get a depiction of Job, who is described without any particular biographical detail, beyond the fact that he lives in Uts, in some land in the east. But he's done quite well for himself. He's got lots of cattle and lots of children and a very big household and servants. And everything seems to be going just fine for him in the short term. He seems to be, as the text says, upright and concerned about God's demands on him, and even worries about what his children might do unintentionally and offers sacrifices to make sure that the accounting is clean even on their behalf. The book then changes scenes, and we end up with a heavenly court scene where God is surveying the other heavenly beings, and the Satan appears, and God asks if he happened while wandering throughout the earth to notice Job. And this sets off a chain of unexpected events in which the Son is given the opportunity by God to challenge Job to see if Job will maintain his commitment to God, because he suggests that Job is only loyal to God because God takes good care of him, and that if the situation was changed, Job would condemn God rather than maintain his loyalty. At first, the Satan takes away largely property and then Job's children. And then in a second round, when Job doesn't break after the first, he goes after Job's physical health. And one might say as a corollary, his mental health, because in that kind of suffering, that's going with it. At which point, several friends or colleagues of Job appear to bring him comfort, and they offer a variety of explanations for why Job is suffering the way he is. And they are all typically patterns of, well, Job, it's probably because of something you did. God doesn't punish people unjustly. A fourth friend, Elihu, then appears, who offers, at least on paper, a similar sort of effort at comfort, none of which Job finds particularly comforting. And in all, Job insists on his own innocence and calls for God to appear to justify God's own case. We do get an appearance of God at the end of the book. God describes all sorts of things about the power of nature and how God constructed the universe, none of which appears to be a direct answer to any of Job's questions. But Job, perhaps wisely, decides it's a good time to shut his mouth and stop complaining, at which point, in response either to that admission or to Job's silence, God offers a kind of doubling of a reward for Job at the end of the book. The number of children are restored is the same, but all his wealth is doubled. And in an interesting comment, Sforno happens to notice that if God had doubled the number of children, then doubling the assets would not have been enough. All of us with children and the cost of schooling will understand that comment. But that gives a basic overview of the book.
Going from there, once we have that overview, is the question that I think this part of Iyov listeners are familiar to some degree. Is it a real true story? Did it happen, or is it just a parable? Which that's going to go together with who wrote the book of Iyov. But let's start if it's real. We can go hand in hand. This is the Gemara in Bava Basra. I think right, Yudal and Beis. But let's talk about there. Let's discuss those two parts, which really go hand in hand with the story before we can kind of delve a little deeper.
I don't think there's any good way to know from a historical perspective if the book actually happened. What I can say is that we have stories like Sefer Iyov already in significant showing in ancient Near Eastern literature. And the problem of the innocent sufferer, particularly in a world where God seems to manifest some sort of justice, bothered lots of ancient people. And many created stories like this. Now, within Jewish tradition, the question of whether Job existed is already, as you've noted, an expansive discussion in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli. And we get lists of times and places where Job may have lived, in the time of Abraham or in the time of the Exodus. We have lots of traditions about him being married to Dinah Bas Yaakov. We have even a tradition that he came back from the exile and opened yeshiva in Tiberia. Part of those debates come from the fact that there simply is no background in the story itself. We just have this guy named Iyov who lives in the land of Uz. The question of whether he's Israelite or not, Jewish or not, and when he lived was a long-standing struggle for Chazal. Plays out in a variety of ways, but one of the ways that I think, and I've tried to argue in my own work, that they tried to resolve this was by assuming Mosaic authorship of Iyov. Because if Moses is in fact the author of the book of Job, there's a time limit or a cutoff point for when Job could have lived. He had to have lived before Moses' death. At the same time, if you want to believe that Job is not an Israelite, the fact that he had a prophetic experience with God also has to happen before Moses' lifetime, because we have rabbinic teachings that there's no non-Jewish prophecy after the death of Moses. And there were reasons, I think, that at least a good number of the rabbis wanted to keep Job a non-Jew because it sort of distanced his story from the Jewish experience. Sure, this kind of thing could happen to a non-Jew, but that's not the way God interacts with Jews. We still follow Deuteronomy. Job gets a slightly different case because he's not a member of the tribe, so to speak. Mosaic authorship remains a common theme even amongst the medieval and later writers. Ibn Ezra, for example, will challenge that and argue that, in fact, the original book of Job was written in another Semitic language and was translated into Hebrew, which is why the Hebrew is so difficult. But he makes no explicit claim on authorship. But if you take that position, then it's not Mosaic authorship.
Yeah, right. So, correct. Chazal and Bava Basra say just that Moshe Ben wrote it, but the Ibn Ezra, it says there in the beginning that it was translated, which kind of... Moshe translated it, or it's kind of unclear from the Ibn Ezra.
It's unclear in his own text.
It's unclear exactly from the Ibn Ezra what's going on. Okay, so as you said, then there's the question of whether it's literal or whether it wasn't literal, and we get into that. I think that this is the part of Iyov that people perhaps know to some degree. Now, we talk about Utz. So right in the beginning, right, it says Ish Haya, and it says he was from Utz. So the Mefarshim, you've surveyed a number of them, do have a discussion about where is Utz.
Well, by the early modern period, the argument is that it's Constantinople or Istanbul. But none of this is certain. The best we're told that it's in the east, but it's the east of where? Interestingly enough, Maimonides doesn't read it as a name of a place. He reads it as an instruction that there was a man in the land Utz, now think about it. All right, that is, take counsel in how you read about it rather than reading it as the name of the place. In truth, I think he's supposed to, I think, from the perspective of the author, be an everyman who could have lived anywhere. Because the question is really about when this type of thing happens to someone, not whether it happened to a particular person. And so the fact that we don't have a clear sense of when he lived, and we don't have a clear sense of where he lived, it means in certain ways that he could have been any of us.
Now, you gave this overview in the beginning. So you say how the story, in the beginning, it's simple enough. The story starts, there was this man, let's say, was Be'eretz Utz, and this is what happened. And then, like we said, we get to Hashem with the Satan. We see, we see that whole story. But then it kind of goes away from a story. Then it's like, the whole middle is not a story. It's it's certainly, I guess, through the eyes of the readers. And this is really what a lot of your work does, a lot of your book is. It's looking through the eyes of the different readers. So whether that's the classical Mefarshim and not so classical Mefarshim in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, Rishayin and whatever. And then also you obviously get to later on more contemporary ones, which we can get to and discuss as well. How did they kind of deal with the Book of Iyov, as you mentioned before, or interpret it?
So I think one of the interesting features of Iyov is that we don't have a volume of Midrash, which I think partly explains its lack of popularity. Right, the only real discussion we have at length from the period of Chazal is the discussion in Bava Batra. There's no freestanding, Iyov Rabbah or anything of the sort. And the early rabbinic discussions largely avoid the middle dialogues. They're interested in the beginning of the book. They're interested in the end of the book, but the middle dialogues don't play a lot of role in those early thinkers. The Rishonim do pay attention to them, but largely to explain difficult words, to try and figure out what Job is asking. It's really only with Maimonides or Rambam that the medieval dialogues take a life of their own, because Maimonides, who's got a philosophical bent, sees those middle dialogues as a philosophical discourse of competing positions on the nature of hashgacha. And at that point, sort of once Maimonides puts a philosophical stamp on it, then there's a whole school of Mefarshim who developed thereafter, Ralbag and Ibn Kaspi, who all try and put a sort of Maimonides guidance for how to read the book into practice by writing commentaries from a Maimonidean bent. Maimonides is very much committed to the fact that it is a mashal. Ibn Kaspi is very worried that if you take it as a mashal, it's a slippery slope. Because if this story is a fiction, what else in Tanakh might you argue is a fiction? And so there are all these philosophical complications that tie into the book because of those middle dialogues and because of Maimonides' philosophical position.
So you've already mentioned a number of Mefarshim, but you also mentioned the lack of kind of medrash, and that speaks to its lack of popularity. But then again, you go to your survey, and one just looks through the Mefarshim. I'm reading Rameir Rama, so that Keda's son. You mentioned the Sforno. We already mentioned the Ralbag and Ibn Kaspi. We can mention Avram Farisol of Italy. That was in the original Mefarshim. It's not anymore. The great 15th century of Italy. I mean, we can go on and on. I mean, you can just mention some of those listed. We have the Tashbatz wrote his commentary. It's actually redone. Iyov Mishpat, I think in the beginning he actually has a lengthy kind of it's almost like a mini book about just general schar v'einish and reward and punishment in this world. You have the Alshich obviously wrote his commentary there. You have and so on. You have Rabbeinu Bechaya. You talk about the Zohar, discuss a lot of it.
Cites it 300 times.
The Ramban, right? The Ramban has a commentary, and so on and so on. I mean, you just there's many more that are in here, and just to make clear for the listener, for those that are either familiar with Sfarim Manach or not, many Sfarim Manach, some of these commentators were on all the Sfarim and some didn't. There are Sfarim that are just written on here. But regardless, I mean, especially in this time we're talking about, time of the Rishonim and then through 16th century, there are a large amount of commentaries being written on the Book of Iyov. So it is popular to a certain degree. And the answer is, and the question is not the answer, the question is, why?
So I think we have to deal with two different kinds of popularity. Right? What we might call a pop culture. That is, what does the average Jewish person on the street know about the book? And then what do the scholarly community speak about among themselves? And I think we're dealing with two different dynamics at play. I think if you're interested as a Jewish thinker in the question of hashgacha, right? It's not all the books that agree on the topic in the Tanakh that are interesting. It's the book that seems to be the exception that raises all the questions. And so if hashgacha is a serious concern, and virtually every commentator we deal with is writing from Galut, right? The question of hashgacha is a serious everyday question for how you go about your life. And so I think there's an interest in Iyov as a model book from which to build a case about hashgacha that attracts the attention of the medieval commentators. That they're looking at the nature of their own lives and the lives of their communities through the parallel to the book of Iyov, because they all, I think, sense that not all suffering seems to be justified. That is, the theory of the universe and the practice of the universe may be different, and discussing the book of Iyov gives them an opportunity to work out those difficulties. At the same time, the absence of a midrash on Iyov may be part of a general trend to try and keep the book away from the general public. We already have a number of passages in rabbinic literature where we know, at least in theory, that they would have preferred that the Targum of Iyov was hidden away, which seems to suggest that there's a real concern about the, so to speak, non-specialist working with Iyov, which seems to be the way it works. And I think the importance of all the commentaries in the Middle Ages is as literacy gains, and Jews are capable of reading these books, there is, I think, an intention on the part of the Mifarshim to make sure they're reading it in the proper way and not misled by the kinds of questions it raises about the nature of hashgacha. And if you're asking serious questions about hashgacha, you're also asking serious questions of concern about the nature of God.
And I think that's something, talking about the Tashbatz's commentary, again, which was redone by Mechon Shlomo Aman a couple of years ago, is you see him working through Schar V'Einish, Hashgacha, and he's using this as like kind of a, I don't know, he's playing off of the book. Was that something that you see in other Mefarshim where they're using it as like a springboard to discuss these kind of topics? Kind of, it's almost like, not to say for Musar and Hashgacha, but that type of thing. They're using the book of Iyov in that way.
So I think the big difference for Duran is really that he's an heir to Maimonidean tradition. That is, if you look at the early Rishonim, and you certainly look at Rashi and his school of thought, they're very interested in the Pshat question, and many of the questions aren't around Hashgacha. They do show up. They're a big fan of the notion that if Job didn't sin with his lips, then he might have sinned in some other way. And so you can justify God's actions because Job isn't entirely blameless. He's just mostly blameless. Once Maimonides starts asking serious questions about the nature of providence and the mechanics of providence built on the book of Job, anyone who's a Maimonidean thereafter sort of has to write a commentary on Job or engage Job seriously at that level, and it changes the way the book is read. It becomes no longer a question of explaining the book, but using the book to explain Hashgacha, and therefore Schar V'Einish.
Now when we turn to one of the other Rishonim, Ibn Ezra. So Ibn Ezra, not only did you seem to enjoy Ibn Ezra, you did an entire translated and heavily annotated edition of Ibn Ezra. Why did you decide to do that, and where does Ibn Ezra play in? We've mentioned some of the other Mefarshim. We actually haven't gotten so much into the styles. We can talk about stylistic differences, but why did you do Ibn Ezra? Because
I'm a glutton for punishment, I think, is the easy lesson. I'm not the first to try and translate Ibn Ezra on Iyov. A professor named Avery tried it as a master's degree once upon a time. He had the disadvantage of trying to do that before there were critical editions of Ibn Ezra on Iyov available. And his project raised a question that I don't think was answered thoroughly enough. He did an excellent job given when he was writing, so it's not a critique of Avery directly. Ibn Ezra works in a peculiar style in which he very often gives you a dibur matchil, or gives you the first half of a pasuk, but really wants to talk about the second half of the pasuk, which he then does by paraphrasing it. So at the end of the day, you as the reader know what he thought of the second half of the pasuk, but you don't know what he thought the dibur matchil means. So when Avery translated Ibn Ezra, the parts that Ibn Ezra doesn't actually comment on, he left in the original Hebrew. And so it's sort of half a translation in that sense. I wanted to try and find a way to translate the whole text. And so I had to make some sort of methodological decisions about how I was going to translate those things where Ibn Ezra doesn't actually tell you what he's thinking. So that the whole book could be explained, and therefore the abundance of the translation. So I made the methodological decision that I would look at all of Ibn Ezra's commentaries and his astrological works and his poetry to try and find the spots where there were verses that he didn't explain in the commentary, to see how he used them and what he might have thought they meant elsewhere. Now, that is a methodological risk because, like any good thinker, Ibn Ezra might change his mind over time. And his commentary on Job is relatively early in his oeuvre. He works on it while he's still in Italy at the beginning of his European wanderings. The distinct feature of Ibn Ezra is that he's an astral determinist. He thinks our lives are largely controlled by the position of the stars and the planets on the day we are born. And thus Job's suffering is not a virtue of anything he's done to deserve punishment. It comes by virtue of being born under the wrong sign. Now, God, in God's beneficence, Ibn Ezra explains, in particular gives the Jews Torah and the possibility of philosophical contemplation so that they can try and work in the system and avoid the things that happen in the world because of the nature of the stars. But that's his distinct philosophical position on the workings of the book. He's actually one of the few of the period who actually defend Job against charges of sinfulness.
Why did you decide, though, okay, English, translation, annotation, like this is what people today in 2026, or when did you publish this, 24, 25?
24, yeah.
Yeah, in 24. This is something they should be reading or might be interested in reading.
I think, in all honesty, I did it more as a project for myself. And as I worked on it, realized that it might be a benefit to others. I was trying to read the commentary and make good sense of the commentary and realized that the kind of research that I needed to do to figure it out might benefit the next kind of reader who had to come along. I'm not sure Ibn Ezra is for everyone, but I wanted to make sure that there was an edition available that made it clear to readers when they did discover that they wanted to work on Ibn Ezra. At the same time, because Ibn Ezra's perspective on Iyov is so distinct from what one would find in Chazal or Rashi or Rambam, which are the commonly read books, that I sort of felt a need to try and fill in the gap, or to put another city on the map of thinkers. And I hoped that the English translation would be there when people were ready for it. I don't know that everyone is suddenly going to go out and suddenly decide that they need to read Ibn Ezra, but I think that people who miss out on reading Ibn Ezra are missing out on serious Jewish thought. He writes from within the tradition, but offers us many different ways of seeing things. He's also, of the Mefarshim working in that period, the best read. He knows classical Arabic literature. He knows classical Arabic. He knows all the philology of the day, and really brings a different perspective to the book than we're used to. Most of us who study Iyov work with Rashi and Rashbam, and Ibn Ezra doesn't make the list. And I think there's reason to add him to the list.
The chapter that you survey, the different commentators, the Mefarshim, is over 200 pages. Just to give a listener the idea, it's 8 parts. So I'll just read the name. Part 1, Job in Jewish Liturgy and Practice. Part 2, Job in Early Rabbinic Literature. Part 3, Job in Medieval Pshat Commentaries. Part 4, Job in Medieval Jewish Philosophical Works. Part 5, Job in Medieval Karaite Works. Part 6, Job in Medieval Jewish Mystical Works. Part 7, Job in Anthological Commentaries. And Part 8, Job in Medieval Jewish Letters and Art. So it's quite long. And we've already mentioned the Rashi and his school, and mentioned Ibn Ezra now and some of the other ones. But are there any others, especially the later commentators, and just in general, kind of a mix here of those that you survey? Do you want to mention some stylistic difference or differences between them, or some examples of those commentators?
Sure, I think I can do that. I should point out that survey really only goes until the 16th century. Yeah. And there are hundreds of texts and concerns. And I'm as you've noted, I'm not only interested in the Mefarshim. I'm also interested in the kinds of essays and sermons and even medical texts where Iyov appears amongst Jews in the Middle Ages. I mean, if we're simply dealing with the Mefarshim, I think we can sort of lay out sort of three classical positions. You can follow Rashi and his school, who run into a problem because if you're committed to Pshat, the book of Iyov doesn't give a good explanation for why Job is suffering, and then you still need to go digging to try and find some sort of justification for the book. And as I noted, they tend to fall back on the rabbinic assumption of Job is imperfectly righteous, and so there's some underlying sin or deficiency that might explain his suffering as a punishment. The second school of thought I think we might look at is the philosophical school that includes Rambam and Ralbag. And in that case, the real sin is not some sort of ritual imperfection. Job's sin for Rambam and his school is really the sin of ignorance because he hasn't properly studied philosophy and has only studied Torah. He doesn't know how the mechanics of the universe really work, and that ultimately, if you really want the eternity that God promises us, one has to perfect one's intellect. And if you're perfecting your intellect, you know that this life is temporary, and that eternal life is what's really promised. And so you won't be caused to suffer by the experience of this life if you can keep it all within that perspective. Again, there are lots of variations on that theme. And it certainly doesn't flesh out his philosophy entirely. But he would also argue that if you're a rationalist and study the sciences, you can also use that knowledge to avoid the causes of suffering. We can remedy disease. We can avoid building our homes on fault lines. We can do all sorts of practical things that also help ward off suffering. The third school, I think we would think of as the Kabbalistic school, and Ramban's probably the best example. Ramban wants to avoid blaming Job specifically for any sin that might have caused what is happening, because the book itself says he didn't do anything to cause his suffering. But he falls back on the reincarnation of the soul, or transmigration, Gilgul Neshamot, to explain Job's suffering, and basically argues that Job's suffering in this life is a redemptive act for the suffering that his soul was scarred by in a previous incarnation. We see this sort of perpetuated in the Zohar, where the Zohar explains that Job is a child of Yivum, and that the mechanics of Yivum are that the soul of the deceased father end up in the new child's body so that the new child can redeem that soul. And so Job is not punished for a sin he committed, but there is justification for the punishment because of a soul that was, because of a sin that was committed in the lifetime of the soul. And those are the three major schools that continue into the modern period, because, to my mind, sadly, the choice is almost always to blame Job for some deficiency that explains his suffering, rather than asking bigger questions about divine justice and whether there might be an injustice going on.
And that is something that you get into the book. We can discuss that, perhaps. But what about two more questions about the commentaries and the Mefarshim? Do you have a favorite commentary? I know you translated Ibn Ezra, but do you have a favorite one? Let's start with that.
I am a fan of the Maimonidean school, and I think Ralbag is probably the most interesting to me. He has slightly more traditionalist leanings than Maimonides, and is trying to work very hard to make Maimonides work in a traditionalist lens. He's also the only commentator from that period who actually speaks about his own historical circumstances at any point in the commentary and tries to relate Job to the experience of exile. I think that many of the other commentators are doing it without being explicit about it, because I don't know how you write about suffering without thinking about your own, but he's actually explicit about it, which I think makes him stand out for me. I will say, as someone who is naturally sarcastic under his own personality flaws, I find Ibn Ezra particularly enticing as a reader because he doesn't hold back. He is quick to criticize where he thinks he can justify the criticism. And I think there's an entertainment value in keeping you involved in reading 42 chapters of commentary in his style. And I think there is merit in that, although there are those who will find it off-putting equally. I will call it my own flaw that I find him so enticing.
The last question I'll ask you about the Mefarshim generally, and we're going to get in a minute to Tisha B'Av, but someone in general wants to pick up Iyov and learn it. It's a hard sefer to say the least. Is there a particular commentary you would recommend to like a beginner to the book of Iyov?
It's an interesting question. I think the issue is always finding the right commentary for the right reader. What constitutes an introduction to Iyov will depend on who you are as a reader. Right? Are you interested in Iyov for questions of hashgacha? You might pick up a very different commentary than someone who's interested in what did Iyov mean in its ancient Near Eastern context. So I think there are a whole variety of very interesting modern commentators and medieval commentators, depending on what you're looking for. At a Pshat perspective, I think the Rashi school, you can read Rashi, Rashbam, and Rabbeinu Tam all together on Iyov. Reading any one of them is inadequate, but the three of them read together will give you a really good perspective on what the language of Job means. If you're interested in questions of philosophy, I think you have to start with Rambam and move to perhaps Ralbag. The advantage of some of those is Rashi. For those who aren't familiar with the Hebrew, there is a competent English edition of Rashi. There is a competent translation of Ralbag as well. And the Moreh Nevuchim is also available in several English translations that will help offer some guidance there. Sorry, you looked like you were going to ask something.
Well, I just wanted to interject and say that we mentioned Rambam a bunch of times. Yeah, it's in Moreh Nevuchim. He discusses Iyov a fair amount in Moreh Nevuchim, for those wondering where. He doesn't have a commentary on Iyov, but that's where it is.
Absolutely. Book 3's chapter 2 and 23 in his discussions of Hashgacha, he provides an overview essentially of the whole book as he understands it. And he sort of laid down the gauntlet for commentators after him, and then had to figure out, well, he did it in 2 chapters. How do we write a commentary on the whole book if we take his thought as a starting position? Modern commentaries are a bit more complex. Da'at Mikra is going to give you a certain kind of scientific approach to the book. Art Scroll is going to anthologize Chazal very well for you. It's really a question of, are you a Pshat reader or are you a Darshan or a Midrashic reader? And you'll have to pick the one that introduces you to Job from the perspective that you're concerned about. I can't judge which one's best for any individual reader.
No, I think that's a good answer. Let's turn.
My publisher would like you to tell you to start with Ibn Ezra.
Right, of course.
Yes.
Which I'll link to in the show notes, both your books, by the way. Okay, let's turn to Tisha B'Av, because the Gemara, the Bavli in Tainis says you can learn on Tisha B'Av, you can learn Chazal. Everyone knows you can learn parts of Gittin, right? The parts about the Churban, but you can learn. You're not to learn most Torah, but you're allowed to learn Eicha, Iyov, and parts of Yirmiyah. And it's paskin like that in Shulchan Aruch as well. That is what you're allowed to learn. So, we can talk about just in general the fact that you're allowed to read Iyov, even though you're not allowed to read a lot of things, but Iyov you're allowed to. And also, were there communities that had a minhag to, in fact, read Iyov? As you mentioned before, Iyov is not part of the liturgy, right? You don't lane Iyov on a Yom Tov. It's not, or on a Shabbos. It's not something that we ever read in practice.
It's a complex question. I think, one, it's important to keep in mind that these are the same rules that apply to morning practice. And they're treated the same way. I think at least in Chazal, it was an offer of hope. That is, they hoped people would want to be so committed to study that even in these dark times, they would want to study something. That was an ideal they were trying to articulate. The second question is, did anyone actually do it? That's a more complicated question. If you look at studies of literacy amongst Jews in ancient antiquity, the Roman period gives us something like between 1% and 3% of Jewish men were literate. So the question is, if you articulate that someone should read a book, who actually could do it? And it seems to me that the obligations here are really about elite study rather than the general public. Now, by the Middle Ages, particularly in Ashkenaz, it did become public practice to read Iyov on Tisha B'Av. And it lasts probably 200 or 300 years of being popular practice in Ashkenaz. And then seems to disappear. And then starts to show up again popularly in North African Jewish communities into the modern period. As you and I both know, there are lots of individual congregations today that do read Iyov, but I think practical considerations largely prevented it. The book's 42 chapters long in very difficult Hebrew, and people don't typically study the book outside of that realm. So what does it mean to be read at for 42 chapters as part of ritual practice? And we have preserved from North African communities a number of epic poems about Job, where it seems that people may have replaced the reading of Job itself with the recitation of the public poem as part of the ritual. So we know that it is going on. It never is entirely popular practice, but it is an encouraged practice. And I think the reason for it is really the last chapter of Iyov, where God offers Job compensation at the end to try and make up for the suffering he's experienced. And I think the reconciliation is, after years of exile, there will be a redemptive moment for the reader as well, which is how they connect it to the Korban and the various destructions that follow. It may be that the book is popular amongst the scholarly elite, despite the fact that it's not part of the popular culture. Rather, not because of it. I mean, I have a student I am working with now at the Hebrew University who's very busy studying how Job permeates the culture of medieval Ashkenaz, and is finding all sorts of fascinating things that even I hadn't yet discovered in my own work. And if you have a custom of popularly reading the book, the verses start to ring in the ears of the people in a way that they don't in other communities. And so they're more likely to turn to Iyov than in other places.
I just want to mention also that the Chida, I think I've quoted this in a different episode about Emmanuel of Rome, the Chida in Shem HaGdolim, in Mareches Sfarim, in letter Beis, he says, Bir upirish Iyov Mishlei Tehillim, which Iyov Mishlei Tehillim is known as Sifrei Emes. So the Chida says, Shemati, I heard, She'amru Bali HaParshim, should be Iyov, in Iyov, Yikari Ha'adam Pirish Ralbag, V'yorvet Samanu. You should learn Ralbag and you will slake your thirst. Ubi Mishlei Yikarish Pirish Emmanuel, and Mishlei you should learn Emmanuel of Rome. Ubi Tehillim Yikari Pirish of David Kimchi, you should learn Radak. So, and then he says, Fas Emes Tichoin Lo'ad, Emes Rashateva is Iyov Mishlei Tehillim, Lo'ad is Levi Emmanuel David. So you can see those are the books you should read, those are the commentaries, the Mefarshim on those books. It's just interesting to read, especially you said before, Al-Bag is your favorite, so the Chida says that that's what he heard that you should read. It's just an interesting quote that I wanted to put out there. Now,
I will say that we have an early modern responsum of Ibn Habib from Yerushalayim, where he's asked if Jews are obligated to believe in Gilgul Neshamot. And in his responsum says that based on Ramban's commentary on Iyov, it's halakhically incumbent on all of us to believe in transmigration. So it seems everyone had their favorites.
By the way, we're not going to go into that topic, but Rav Sajigan and Emunas Fideis says that that's a non-Jewish belief, transmigration. So just so you see, he's saying it's an incumbent, that Rav Sajigan says that's not a Jewish belief whatsoever. Just again, that's just as an aside. I don't think the one thing I don't do in my book is make a judgment about who's right. Right? Because I think the really interesting feature in all of this is what constitutes from the perspective of normative, legitimate Jewish thought, right? That all of the people, with the exception of perhaps the chapter on the Karaites, right? Everyone else is writing from within rabbinic tradition. And those who think that Gilgul is a requirement, and those who think that it's apikorsis, right, are both writing from positions inside the tradition. Another thing that you focus on or discuss a fair amount is Iyov post-Holocaust. And that's something we can kind of, when we really turn to the matter, it's funny, when the chapter that you discuss the commentaries, 200 pages, is really all on medieval commentaries and mefarshim and all that stuff. When it gets later on, or the other part, you kind of jump all the way over and focus on it post-Holocaust. So
I should probably just explain that organization. The book consists of essentially a collection of essays. It opens with a discussion of Mosaic authorship of Iyov and how it plays out. It moves from there to Rava's claim that Job denied the resurrection of the dead. Then we get a chapter on Rashbam's commentary, then a chapter on Rambam and how he reads Iyov, and then a chapter on Rav Soloveitchik. And in order to contextualize Rav Soloveitchik's Kol Dodi Dofek, I had to look at what other post-Holocaust writers were saying about Job in the same period to contextualize it. The sixth chapter in the book is the sort of survey that we've been discussing till this point, and it makes up a good chunk of the book, but in my mind, it's still only the sixth chapter of amongst several in terms of the organizing of the book. But the post-Holocaust question is really a fascinating one from my perspective, because we can see a large transition in the way the book of Job gets read by Jews across the religious spectrum. Historically, the book of Job gets read falling back on the dictum that there is no punishment without sin. If you apply that same dictum after the Holocaust, you end up pointing a finger at the victims of the Holocaust as being complicit in their own suffering. And that articulation sat very, very uncomfortably for rabbinic leadership and Jewish thought leadership in the wake of the Shoah. It just sat very difficultly that pointing the finger to blame Holocaust victims for the Shoah just sat so it created such emotional turmoil that I think it changed the way people read Iyov. And Iyov became a book by which to defend Holocaust victims. It's the book that says there can be suffering without sin. I don't think it happens on its own just because of the Holocaust, right? We also have the Enlightenment that happens in between. The period of the Maskilim also has a tremendous impact on how Jews read. But I think collectively the Enlightenment and the enormity of the suffering of the Shoah in certain ways sent Jewish interpreters back to the drawing board to figure out what Iyov meant. That they just couldn't read it the same way that their ancestors had.
Yeah, as you mentioned, called the Deifik, that's a book that you particularly discuss and I think focus a whole chapter on discussing, correct?
I do. I write about Soloveitchik in large part because I think his it's not a commentary on Iyov. Kol Dodi Dofek is given as an indictment of American Jewry in the period of the War of Attrition. He gives it on Yom HaAtzmaut, 1956, to try and rally the American Jewish community to greater support of Israel. And in so doing, calls on Iyov as a model of someone who had the capacity to do more good, but did so insufficiently. And he's drawing a parallel between American Jewry and Iyov, saying sort of, don't be like Iyov. At the same time, though, he starts from a premise that you can't look at the sufferer and point a finger at them and say, this is why you're suffering, which I think is largely shaped by the fact that we're only, a decade or so past the end of the war. And he's speaking to a community that includes a good number of victims of the Shoah. People who've been relocated or saved or survived the camps or who were lucky enough to be in the U.S. rather than in Europe. And he doesn't want to point the finger, but somehow still falls back on pointing the finger. And what's interesting is that people who would see themselves as the Rav students, Hartman, Norman Lamb, Yitz Greenberg, and others, don't bite. They won't take the same position as the Rav on Iyov. They all try to argue that Iyov is evidence that that one can suffer without sin, and therefore they have to argue that Iyov did nothing to bring this about, to bring about his own suffering. And in that way, it leaves them open to discuss Holocaust victims as suffering independent of their own actions.
I want to roll back, actually, to kind of the medieval period before, which is Iyov and its role in the Christian-Jewish polemic. This is something that comes up. So if you want to tell the listeners a little about that, because that's interesting as well.
You know, when you share characters of significance or figures of significance with other religious traditions, each group is going to put their favorites or those they think offer the most valuable lessons on a certain kind of pedestal. Starting in antiquity, Iyov became a model of patient endurance of suffering that Christianity, which because of the suffering of their own Messiah, also saw as a valuable lesson. That is, from their perspective, Jesus and Job shared a certain kind of suffering pattern. And that became the basis for the sort of traditional statements about Job's patience and endurance. Jewish tradition did not see Job as particularly patient. Job's sin in Jewish tradition is largely framed by the things he utters in the middle dialogues, and many of the certainly within Chazal, and then many of the Mifarshim, saw those middle dialogues as proof of the fact that Job was not a pious sufferer, but rather a rebellious, perhaps blasphemer. And as Christianity raised the bar on Job, Jewish responses to Job actually became somewhat harsher. It was almost as if as Christians turned Job into a hero, Jews turned him into a kind of a villain, someone who didn't react properly to his suffering and wasn't appropriately pious. And that continued to play out in the medieval polemics and the vikuchim of the Middle Ages, because I think if you have a tradition that Moses is the author, Job now falls into the category of Torah. And you have to do something to explain it once it's in that category. And it was a constant challenge because you had, for many Jews, they were living in Christian lands where they confronted the fact that in sermons and stained glass and all sorts of other forms, Christians were constantly telling Jews what Job meant. And so Jews needed to prepare responses within their own teachings for reinforcing Jewish belief against that outward assault.
You talked all in the beginning of the episode, the overview, and you mentioned the ending of Iyov, the ending of Job, and how it always bothers people. So you mentioned like why and kind of what your personal kind of take or your feeling is after being so immersed in Iyov all these years.
There is within biblical scholarship, and by biblical scholarship, I mean academic biblical scholarship, an assumption that the ending is added to the book of Job later, that it's a supplement, to try and offer some sort of happy reconciliation to the book. Because Job, for all that Job lost, he sort of inherits a new family and great wealth. And for the reader, we're somehow supposed to assume that that's an okay resolution, that replacement stuff and a replacement family is somehow an okay response to all the loss that he had faced. And it may have worked for some readers. It complicated things for others. So the question of whether the 10 children that Job gets at the end of the book are the same 10 children who are supposedly killed at the beginning of the book left some readers very disturbed. Ramban, for example, argues that the children are actually never killed, Satan has them hidden away, and Job believes they're dead, but they're not really dead, and they're brought back at the end of the book. Because the idea that one can have replacement children doesn't sit well. Others simply tolerated that this was some form of replacement. And there are others who raise the question of whether the doubling of assets is a commitment to Pishnayim as a form of compensation. All right. God perhaps left Job in a position of being caused nezek, and here is the double to compensate him for it. I think that I sit comfortably with Elie Wiesel, who argues that the ending is entirely unsatisfactory, that his admiration for Job was higher when Job was fighting for justice than when he had reconciled himself to happy living later. And I think that demand for continued protest sits most comfortably for me as a reader. But in order to do that, you have to adopt Wiesel's position that the end was basically tacked on and doesn't really belong to the book. Most of the readers of the tradition all read the book as if it was one whole, and that was part and parcel of it. I think for moderns, the question of replacement children and replacement stuff sits less comfortably. I think for the medievals who were constantly suffering and constantly dealing with loss, it may have resonated differently.
Let's end with this. You're someone, as is evident from this and the two books that you've written, is immersed in Iyov, and as you said, you're still working on it, thinking about it even after these books. What's your pitch to a listener to read Iyov? You know, I think you discussed this in the book, and you've discussed it here. Many people today are not very familiar with Iyov. So what would be your pitch to them and say, okay, perhaps take a chance, pick up Sefer Iyov and learn it?
Well, I think I would start, if your Hebrew is good, the book is beautiful poetry. It is some of the best examples of biblical poetry we have, and it is the except for the frame story in the first couple chapters and the last couple chapters, it's almost all written in poetry. From the perspective of its contents, it offers depictions of the heavens unlike other books. It offers depictions of the nature of God and God's actions that are different from other books. It offers depictions of the Satan as a fully formed character we don't see in other biblical books. And so if you want to have a sense of the range of views of the workings of the universe that the Tanakh offers, you really can't do it without reading Iyov. It offers scenes and depictions that simply don't show up in any of the other books. And so our view of the Tanakh is entirely incomplete without reading Iyov.
Okay, so I will link to both books in the show notes. And thank you, Professor Kalman, for joining me to discuss Iyov.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.